3 years after the Peloponnesian War, an amazing event happened that has since become known to history as the March of the 10,000. And so that will be the topic of this lecture. The March of the 10,000 occurred during the time of the Spartan hegemony, but it really is a separate event since the action occurred deep in Persia itself. Now, before we get to the March of the 10,000, I want to establish the context of the events leading up to this epic adventure. And there are three leading players in this expedition. There is Cyrus, Clearchus, and Xenophon. And so we will talk about their backgrounds right now. Now, the Persian king Darius II died at the end of the Peloponnesian War. The mantle passed to his son Artaxerxes, who became the next king. But the other son, Cyrus, also wanted the throne for himself. Now, during the Peloponnesian War, Darius II had dispatched Cyrus to the west to support the Spartans against the Athenians. And Cyrus provided a lot of money that Lysander used to build ships for the Spartan fleet. Cyrus also was appointed a satrap in the western part of the Persian Empire, along with Anabasis and Xenophon, and you will remember those names from the Peloponnesian War. Now, after the war, Cyrus began to plot to take the throne from his brother, and so he started to form a rebel army. Okay, so that's kind of the background on Cyrus. Now, also at the end of the Peloponnesian War, a Spartan general named Clearchus was the commander of the garrison at Byzantium. So he was very much involved with those battles in the Hellespont during the Peloponnesian War. Now, he apparently was a brutal ruler. And when he left Byzantium for a short trip, the people opened the gates and literally handed the city over to Alcibiades. So Alcibiades was able to take Byzantium without a fight. Clearchus returned to Sparta and plotted his revenge. And so he made his way back to Byzantium with an army of Peloponnesian hoplites, intending to take Byzantium back. In Sparta, however, the ephors recalled him once they realized it was Clearchus' brutality that had led to the revolution in Byzantium. Clearchus, though, simply ignored the order and was able to retake Byzantium, hoping that this would restore him back to good graces with Sparta. It did not, and he was condemned to death by Sparta. And I guess it's never really a good idea to ignore orders from your Spartan superiors. But that's the reputation Clearchus had. He often disobeyed orders. And he also had this brutal reputation, so he might just be the right man for this job in Persia. Now, after the Peloponnesian War, Clearchus has this army that's still in Byzantium doing nothing. And so this is perfect for Cyrus because Byzantium is just across the water from Persia. And so he gave Clearchus a sum of money to essentially hire out a Greek hoplite army. And Clearchus accepts this offer, since he has nothing to lose at this point, since he has to escape that Spartan death sentence. So why not head into Persia? Now, it's very important to note that early on, Cyrus led the Greeks into believing that this was a fight against Xenophon in the west. He didn't reveal the true meaning of the campaign, which of course was to fight his brother Artaxerxes for all of Persia. Now, this 10,000, as it's been called, consisted of Greeks from almost every city-state. Megarians, Athenians, Thebans, Syracusans, and the list goes on and on. Now, interestingly, Sparta loosely supported this endeavor since Cyrus had been such a good friend during the Peloponnesian War. They supported it even with Clearchus as one of the generals in command. Now, I should point out that the 10,000 is a literary convention. In reality, it was 13,000 Greeks. I guess it's easier to say the 10,000 than it is the 13,000. In any event, there were around 10,400 Greek hoplites, which composed the heavy infantry, and there were around 2,600 light troops. Now, I should also point out that there were several Greek generals that had command of their own division, although Clearchus seems to have been the main general in command. Now, I want to make one final point about the 10,000. And that is the 10,000 were, of course, mercenaries and would work only for pay. And one of the main reasons for this was the fact that the Peloponnesian War had battered the economies of many of the cities in Greece. And so with no chance to earn a living, many of the Greek hoplites increasingly offered their services for pay. Now, I don't want to suggest that these were the first Greek mercenaries. They were not. But from this point on, the frequency of Greek hoplites hired out by other city-states increased. Now let's talk about Xenophon. Now, Xenophon is good friends with one of the generals going on this campaign, Proximus. And Proximus is a Boeotian who is trying to convince his good friend Xenophon to go on this adventure. Xenophon, though, isn't sure, and he consults with Socrates, who in turn tells Xenophon that he must consult the oracle first. Xenophon, of course, consults the oracle and got the go-ahead from the oracle, And so now he is part of this collection of Greeks. Xenophon, by the way, at this point was not a general. He probably was more of a mid-level officer, and it is Xenophon who will write about this campaign years later. So that's the overall context for this campaign. And so now that Cyrus has everything set, he gathers his Persian rebels and his Greek hoplite army at Sardis and starts marching deep into the heart of the Persian Empire. Xenophon refuses to join Cyrus, and so he heads back to the Persian capital at Susa to inform Artaxerxes about what is going on in the west. Now, about the time the army reached Tarsus, which you can see right here on the map, the first major problem occurred. The Greek contingent would march no further. And apparently they began to suspect that Cyrus was marching against his brother Artaxerxes. And that, of course, was not what they signed up for. Now, according to Xenophon, Clearchus tried to keep the Greeks moving ahead, and so he decided to continue the march on his own. And I can see him saying something to the effect, "Fine, men, I'll continue by myself." Well, as soon as he started this charade, his own troops began to stone him, and apparently Clearchus barely escaped with his life. And that was the last time Clearchus would try to pull off that kind of stunt, and he quickly realized that the Greek soldiers meant business and they would march no further. Now, a short time later, Clearchus summoned his men to a meeting and tried to get back into the good graces with his soldiers. And he said something to the effect that I could have kept all of this money that Cyrus gave me for myself, but I have chosen to share it with you. But now that you won't march anymore and won't listen to me anymore, you have forced me to decide between Cyrus and yourselves. But I could never betray the Hellenes, and so I choose you. I go where you go. Now, that was a pretty good speech by Clearchus, because he was able to get back into the good graces with his own soldiers and pin all of the blame on Cyrus, because he makes it quite clear that he was deceived too. Now, Cyrus is in a state of confusion, and he is wondering what is going on with the Greeks. And so he summoned Clearchus to join him in his tent to try to seek a quick resolution to this crisis. But Clearchus refuses. But Clearchus sends a secret message to Cyrus, asking Cyrus to keep on sending for him, and then he would keep refusing. And so this would make Clearchus look even better in the eyes of his men, and make Cyrus look worse. But he promised Cyrus that everything would work out in the end. And so Clearchus is playing quite the game here. He's got everybody against each other while he's trying to play peacemaker. I wonder if he was related to Alcibiades in any way. Now, the crisis was finally solved when Cyrus realized what the soldiers really wanted, and that was a pay raise. And that's exactly what he promised them, and the march continued on. And later on, Cyrus would finally inform the Greeks that his true intention was to advance on Babylon. And of course, that meant a battle against the great king, Artaxerxes. Now, a short time later, another dispute occurred, and of course it had to involve the Greeks. Apparently, there was some sort of conflict between Clearchus's contingent and another Greek contingent. And at some point, Clearchus was returning from a river, and he was attacked by this other Greek contingent. Now, I suppose it's always a dangerous thing to get a bunch of Greeks together from different city-states, because hostilities will eventually break out. And so Clearchus ran back to his camp, ordered his men to arms, the other contingent brought their arms, and this huge battle is about to take place when Cyrus comes galloping on his horse between the two lines. Now, I have to give Cyrus some credit here, because that's extremely brave to get between two factions of angry ancient Greeks. Nonetheless, he jumps off his horse and proclaims that if these two sides come to blows, the fate of the army is sealed and everyone will die. And that sort of calmed the situation down. I don't think the Greeks really wanted to attack their employer after all. And as I said, calmer nerves prevailed, and this crazy march continued on. And as I said, I got to give a lot of credit to Cyrus. He really kept this whole thing going when at several points it looked like it was all going to fall apart. So he really was deserving of the royal crown. Now, the Greeks will fight together as a cohesive unit when they eventually do fight the great king. But on the way to Babylon, there were several disputes. Now, eventually they finally end up in the heart of the Persian Empire, and that would set up the definitive battle, the Battle of Kuhnax. Now, Cyrus arrived first on the battlefield with his army, and here he waited for his brother. Now, Xenophon relates that in the distance they could see this huge cloud of dust rising high above the plain, and that was the Persian royal army under Artaxerxes. And as they set up, the king was in the center, and Xenophon was on the left. Now Cyrus was in the middle with his bodyguard of 600, and the Greeks took up the position of honor on the right flank. Now after Cyrus saw his brother in the middle of the Persian formation, he ordered the Greeks to attack the Persian center. But Clearchus refused, assuring Cyrus that everything would be okay. And there was a reason for this. You can see here that the Persians already extended past the left flank of Cyrus, and so they overlapped that wing by a distance of a mile. Now, if the Greeks charged toward the center, the Persian left wing would also overlap Cyrus's right. And so that could have led to a situation in which both sides were outflanked by the Persian royal army. And that would have been a very bad situation indeed. Now, the battle opened up with the Greeks charging the Persian left flank. And the Persian chariots, which had been in front of the Persian royal army, simply moved out of the Greeks' way and allowed them to charge right into the Persian left flank. And the Greeks obliterated the Persians and drove them right off the battlefield. And so the Greeks were in hot pursuit of the retreating left flank of the Persian royal army. And at one point, both formations were several miles away from the battlefield. Now, there's been a lot of speculation as to what the motives of Xenophon were, because he was one of the best Persian generals. And usually when your left flank is shattered, the rest of the army will retreat. But the Persian center and Persian right flank held firm. And so there has been some speculation that Xenophon knew the Greeks would overwhelm his flank, and so he would be in control of a retreat that would lead the best unit, the Greeks of course, off of the battlefield altogether. And so the Persian center and the Persian right wing were aware of this strategy, and that's why they didn't flee in terror after they saw their left wing overwhelmed. And this was a similar tactic, by the way, that Hannibal would use against the Romans. In some battles, Hannibal would try to lead the best Roman units off of the battlefield altogether, and then he could focus on the weaker elements. So with the Greeks and Xenophon's left flank off of the battlefield, the Persians launched their own assault against Cyrus's left flank, and they overlapped it, as you can see right here. And they split into two. One section went straight towards Cyrus's camp, and the other section attacked Cyrus's left flank. Now, the Persian royal cavalry that was on the left also attacked Cyrus's camp as well. And so during this battle, Cyrus's camp was being destroyed and the supplies looted. Now, in order to win the battle, Cyrus had to kill his own brother in combat. And so he launched his own attack with his bodyguard of 600. And they made it across the battlefield and engaged the Persian royal center. And a fierce battle broke out. But Cyrus and almost all of his bodyguard were killed. Now, with the death of Cyrus, the Persian rebels fled the battlefield, and that left it open to the royal Persian army. Now, Artaxerxes was wounded as well, but he survived, and so he would retain the royal crown. Now, eventually, the Greeks made their way back to the battlefield and saw their camp being looted and destroyed. Clearchus debated with the other generals whether they should go in force to save the camp or to remain where they were. By this time, Xenophon, with whatever he had left of his left flank, had linked up with the king, and they were set to launch a final assault on the Greeks. And the Greeks by this time were wondering where Cyrus was and where the rebel army was as well. Nonetheless, they had to face off against the entire Persian royal army. And so Clearchus gave the command, and the Greeks advanced towards the Persians. But this time the Persians didn't even wait around to fight the Greeks. They fled in terror back to their camp. The Greeks marched up to the camp and waited. By now the sun was going down, and so the Greeks called off the attack and retreated back to the camp, which by now had been utterly destroyed. The Greeks found almost all of their supplies destroyed, and even worse, they still had no idea where Cyrus was. Now, during the night, the Greeks were able to scour the battlefield for wooden arrows and wooden shields, and they were able to use these items to start campfires. Now, the next morning, the Greeks found out the awful truth, that Cyrus was dead, and that meant the Greeks had no employer, no supplies, they had no line of retreat, and even worse, they were right in the middle of the Persian Empire. Now, Artaxerxes ordered the Greeks to lay down their arms, but the Greeks refused. And Clearchus replied simply, and I love this line by the way, "Conquerors don't give up their arms." And so there was this dialogue back and forth about who actually won the battle. But I think the Greeks had the better argument here because they had driven the Persian forces not once but twice off of the battlefield. Nonetheless, one of the great king's heralds asked Clearchus what the Greek intentions were. Would there be peace or war? And Clearchus refused to answer. But the next day, Clearchus ordered the Greeks to form up on the battlefield in the same spot they had been in the previous day. Now, Artaxerxes was shocked by this and desired to seek a truce with the Greeks, and he promised to provide provisions and safe passage to the Greeks as long as they didn't pillage the countryside. And so Clearchus agreed to this resolution, but it would fall apart, and that would lead to one of the most famous retreats in Greek history, a retreat that would see the 10,000 have to make their way through endless deserts, snow-covered mountains, impassable rivers, and many other obstacles, and we will get to that in the next video.